Do you know what it feels like to walk into a house believing you've found safety, only to realize you've walked straight into hell? That was my marriage. That was the life I was handed the day I left my father's home. I was young, full of hope, maybe even naive. I thought marriage meant love, partnership, respect. I thought I was stepping into a family that would cherish me as their own. I remember my wedding day clearly. The laughter, the music, the way everyone smiled as they blessed us. I believed every word, every smile. I thought I was lucky. But the truth, my dear, the truth was waiting for me behind closed doors. The first night I expected nervousness, maybe shyness, but what I found was cruelty. Not love, not tenderness. My husband's eyes weren't kind. They were hungry, sharp, filled with something darker than lust. And as he forced himself on me, tearing away the illusion of love I had carried, I realized I was not his wife. I was his property. But it didn't stop there. Oh, how I wish it had. Because it wasn't just him. No. That entire family, his brothers, his cousins, even his father, they looked at me not as a daughter-in-law, but as something to be used, broken, shared, one by one. They carved pieces of me away, as if I were nothing more than a body to be passed around. And I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. Because where could I go? Who would believe me? They called it tradition, whispered it like a secret that everyone knew, but no one spoke aloud. The new bride wasn't a bride at all. She was prey. I remember the bruises, the bleeding, the way my cries echoed through the dark halls of that house, and no one came. Not my mother-in-law, not the neighbors, no one. They all knew, and they all stayed silent. And every morning, I had to wake up, cook for them, serve them tea, smile like nothing had happened, while inside I was shattering into pieces. You see, people think monsters live in the woods, in dark alleys, in abandoned houses. But the worst monsters, they sit at dinner tables, wear wedding rings, smile at festivals. They hold your hand in front of the world and strangle your soul behind closed doors. That was my life. That was my reality. And tonight, as I tell you this story, I want you to feel it. The horror of being trapped, the betrayal of family, the loneliness of crying into a pillow while everyone around you pretends they don't hear. Because my marriage wasn't the beginning of love. It was the beginning of war. Every night in that house felt like a lifetime. The walls held my screams. The floor carried my bruised body. And the silence was worse than the violence, because silence meant they all knew. Silence meant they chose to let it happen. Do you know what it's like to lose track of yourself? To look in the mirror and not recognize the woman staring back? That's what they did to me. Piece by piece, they stripped away who I was. My laughter, my softness, my hope. I became hollow. I became nothing. My husband, if I can even call him that, was the cruelest of all. He wanted me to know I was trapped. He wanted me to understand that I had no way out. No one will believe you. He whispered once, his face so close I could smell the liquor on his breath. You're ours, forever, forever. That word became my prison. Days blurred together. My body carried bruises like second skin. Sometimes I'd press my fingers against them just to remind myself I was still alive. At night, When they dragged me into the shadows of that house, I prayed for death. I prayed not to wake up. But every morning I did. And every morning I had to tie my hair, put on clean clothes, and pretend I wasn't dying inside. Even my mother-in-law. Oh, her eyes haunt me still. She knew. She always knew. But instead of saving me, she looked at me with something that felt like satisfaction, as if my suffering somehow fed her. She would hand me a tray of tea the next morning, her lips curled into a cold smile, and say, "Be a good wife. Endure. This is your duty." My duty? To be torn apart night after night? To bleed in silence so their pride, their so-called traditions, could live? And the worst part, my dear, was the loneliness, the crushing weight of knowing no one, not my parents, not my neighbors, not God himself, was coming to rescue me. I was on my own. But in the deepest pit of despair, a small flicker began to burn. At first it was faint, like the glow of a dying candle, but it grew, slowly, quietly, and that flicker was anger. One night, after they had all left me broken on the floor, I lay there staring at the ceiling, my body trembling, my soul was hollow, and I thought, what if I stopped being afraid? What if I stopped begging? What if I stopped being their victim? That was the first time I felt it. The shift, the birth of something new inside me. It wasn't hope. No. Hope had died long ago. It was rage, pure searing rage. And once rage is born, it never dies. Rage is a strange thing. At first it burns you from the inside, like fire trapped in your chest. But then if you let it, it changes shape. It becomes something sharper, something stronger. That's what happened to me. At first I hid my anger. I wore it like a second skin beneath the mask they forced me to wear. They thought they had broken me completely. They thought I was too weak, too scared, too ashamed to fight back. And for a time, maybe they were right. But the truth? I was watching, learning, waiting. I began with small things, very small. A glance held too long, a word left unanswered. Once when my husband barked an order, I delayed by just a heartbeat before obeying. It was nothing, but to me it was everything. It was a reminder. I still exist. I still have a choice, even if it's tiny. And when I cooked, I learned which herbs made men's stomachs twist, which spices left them coughing in pain. I'd sprinkle just enough to see them sweat, to see them groan, while I stood there smiling like the dutiful wife. They never suspected. It gave me power, a secret, a weapon. At night I began hiding scraps of food, coins left carelessly on the table, needles and bits of cloth, small things that wouldn't matter to anyone else but to me. They were tools, tools for survival, tools for escape, tools for revenge. But my anger wasn't only in actions, it was in my silence too. When they hurt me, when they tried to break me, I stopped crying. I stopped begging. I let my face go cold, my eyes empty. Do you know how much it terrifies a monster when their prey stops screaming? They started to notice. My husband would grab my chin, force my eyes to meet his and growl, "What are you plotting, woman?" And I would smile. Just the faintest, cruelest smile, and say nothing. Inside, though, my heart was pounding, because yes, I was plotting. And then came the night that changed everything. I overheard them. In the courtyard, when they thought I was asleep, I heard their laughter. My husband, his brothers, his father, talking about me as if I were meat, joking about whose turn it would be, mocking the bruises, laughing at the tears. And something inside me snapped. My fists clenched so hard my nails cut my palms. My whole body shook. And in that moment I knew. I couldn't just survive anymore. I couldn't just endure. No, I had to make them pay. Not with words, not with prayers, not with silence, but with blood. They thought they had chewed me down to nothing. They had counted my breaths and decided how many I could spend. They never guessed I would learn to listen the way a huntress listens. Not with rage first, but with patience. Patience was my weapon. Patience was the mask I wore while I gathered myself like a storm. I won't tell you how to break a lock or how to fold paper into a note that burns a heart. I will tell you what I felt. I spent evenings like a ghost, moving through the house with the silence of one who has nothing left to lose. I learned their rhythms. Which brother left the back door unlocked on Thursdays? Who stumbled home tipsy on market nights? Which window looked into the dark patch behind the granary where no one cared to look? I memorized their laughter, because laughter is the map of a man's confidence, and confidence is where men hide their fear. At first it was small things. I placed an extra cup where a hand might brush it, and watched how quickly a man reached for it. I left an unfinished meal and observed which of them returned later to finish it alone. These were the only comforts they allowed themselves. Solitude in the corners of the house. Moments when they believed they were safe. I watched those corners like a hawk. I walked them like a prayer. Every night I stitched small lies into truth. I told the neighbors I was fine. I mended the clothes I was given, even those stained with violence, and ironed them so the house would not suspect the storm brewing in their kitchen. There is a weirder kind of fury that comes from pretending to be ordinary, while you are anything but. It is the silence that tastes of iron in your mouth. It is the steady coiling in your belly that will not ease until justice, whatever shape you name it, hammers at the door. I learned to speak softly to myself in the hours when they believed I slept. Those hours were the ones I used to make small, certain plans. I practiced the face I would wear if anyone asked what had happened. Blank, composed, the same woman who pours tea with steady hands. I practiced leaving the room slowly so there would be no rush, no flinch to betray me. I practiced being boring. Boring is a cloak. It makes men careless. Careless is how they get broken. Do you understand the cruelty of training yourself to be forgettable? I became the wallpaper of that house, a smear of quiet color against their noise. And as wallpaper I watched them become louder, more certain. That very certainty spelled their undoing. Pride is a blind thing. It does not see the small trembling beneath the surface. Pride does not imagine the person it owns might be plotting a revolt in the quiet of night. One evening I overheard my mother-in-law speaking about a cousin who would lend them money for the harvest, a man who would visit in a week, someone who liked to take walks alone behind the storehouses. Men like that talk in the dark, thinking no one listens. They map their secrets with careless mouths. I listened. I learned. I folded that passing mention into a plan. There were nights I almost broke. There were nights when the idea of revenge itself frightened me. Not because I feared the act, but because I feared what would be left of me afterwards. I wondered in those hours whether I would step over the line or fall into it. I prayed, not for forgiveness, but for steadiness, for the hand that would not shake when I had to do what had to be done. Then the festival came. A shallow, ridiculous pause where the whole village pretended everything was merry. The house filled with relatives wearing their best clothes. Laughter and song floated in the courtyard. The men sat with their pride like crowns. It was the perfect time for something imperfect to happen. On the night the cousin arrived, the house stank of cardamom and oil lamps. The men drank and told stories. They boasted about how the harvest would be theirs. They stood in small circles and clapped one another on the back, thinking themselves untouchable. I moved among them like a ghost, carrying a tray, smiling when expected, bowing my head when their glances landed on me. My hands did not tremble. They were steady as stone. I made eye contact with my husband once, long enough for him to feel the strike of a look that was not the same frightened deer he had raised. For the first time, the arrogance in his chest wavered. He saw in my face what he had not been able to press down since that first night. The ember that had been smoldering. In that second before he could speak, I knew the house would never be the same. What I cannot tell you is how I felt as the plan fell into place. There is a cold, clinical part of me that remembers the sequence without feeling, and there is the other part where memory is a smear of red light and thunder. I can tell you this. When men who never fear are given a night to boast, they expose themselves. They laugh louder. They wander farther from the door. They find corners where they think their hands will remain unseen. That is when you move. That is when you step out from under the wallpaper, and you show them you are no longer invisible. I did not strike like the heroines in movies. I did not roar or deliver lines. I acted like a woman who had seen too much and had no time for dramatics. I stepped into a courtyard corner where the lamps threw long shadows, and I waited. I watched one of them stagger away from the others, drunk and talkative, boasting of an incident from years before. He laughed about it and slapped his knee. He did not notice me approach. He did not notice anger had taken my face. He only noticed that the world had changed when his laugh choked, and he realized a shadow had closed over his joy. When he saw me, his eyes widened, then narrowed with the quick, ugly calculus of a man who has been cornered. You could smell his fear then. Sour and sharp. He cursed and lunged. I moved like I had to. Not with grace, but with survival. And when the night ended for him, it was as if some small ledger in the universe had been balanced. Word spread like a gust. First there were rumors, then a silence so thick it roared in my ears. The men clustered closer together after that, their bravado peeled back to a thin, protective film. They watched me differently, not with the same contempt, but with a flinty, unsure caution. That caution was my ally. It was a chink in their armor, but the danger increased. They began to talk of my behavior in hushed tones. They set traps of their own. Insults placed where I would find them. Taunts to unnerve me. Suggestions that I was mad. My mother-in-law's smiles became sharper, threaded with suspicion. The house was smaller now, like a throat closing around a mouth. And yet, I kept moving forward. I had tasted something that had nothing to do with joy. The knowledge that I had power against them, that their names could not simply be traps for my silence anymore. My revenge was no longer a private wish. It had become a course of action that might free other women they had taken for granted. That thought steadied me more than any prayer. There were nights I rehearsed the last words I would say, if they asked me why. That I had waited so long, because I wanted them to see the face of the woman they broke. I wanted them to carry that image with them into the dark, to know that their laughter would be answered. But even then I knew there would be no undoing of what was done. There would only be balance, and then perhaps some terrible quiet in which I would have to live with what I had become. So I kept doing what I had learned best. I watched. I waited. I moved like a shadow until the moment came when the house could no longer pretend nothing had changed. Do you hear me breathing, child? Even now, all these years later, the memory of that night makes my chest heavy. I can almost smell the smoke from the lamps, the stench of their sweat, the bitter taste of iron in my throat. That was the night everything ended, and everything began. If you're still watching, don't forget. Give this story a like, subscribe, and stay with me, because stories like this aren't just mine. They are the stories of women who never lived to tell them. The house was restless that night. They were loud, drunk again. But beneath the laughter there was something sharper. Suspicion. They had begun to sense that I was no longer their puppet. Their eyes followed me as I crossed the courtyard with a tray of cups. Their mother's smile trembled at the corners, stretched too wide, like paper about to tear. But you know the thing about men who believe they own the world. They can't imagine the world turning on them. That arrogance is always their weakness. I had hidden the truth in plain sight. I had written down names, dates, the things they did, the bruises they left. I kept it beneath the floor mat, where no one bothered to clean. Weeks earlier, when I slipped away under the excuse of visiting the market, I had found a policeman who wasn't like the others, a quiet man with tired eyes. I told him enough to make him listen. He didn't promise me miracles, only that if I could give him proof, he would act. Proof. And timing. Timing. That was everything. That night, as the eldest brother staggered back into the shadows, I whispered to the boy who served them wine. A servant, no older than 15, someone who had seen more than he dared to say. Now, I told him. His eyes widened, but he nodded. He slipped out the back gate, barefoot, silent, a shadow carrying my signal. The minutes crawled. My heart pounded like a drum in a funeral march. Then, pounding on the door, voices. The gate splintered as lanterns flared in the courtyard. Police boots, heavy, echoing on the stone. For the first time, the men looked afraid. Their faces drained of color. Their hands froze mid-gesture. Their mother screamed, swore it was a mistake, tried to push me forward as if to say I was the liar. But I had my book, my little ledger of horrors. I held it like scripture. One by one, the officers read names, accusations. My brothers-in-law raged, spat, called me a witch, a traitor, a whore. My husband lunged at me, eyes bulging, spittle flying. But an officer shoved him down. The sound of his body hitting the floor was the sweetest thunder I ever heard. For a second, the world tilted. After all those years of silence, their voices were no longer louder than mine. For the first time, they were the ones who trembled. But don't think, child, that it ended neatly. Justice is never clean. Their family screamed for blood. The neighbors whispered that I had cursed my own home. Even some policemen muttered that I should have endured, as if a woman is nothing more than a vessel for pain. The trials dragged on, lies tangled with truths. But I did not bend. I stood in that courtroom with my scars bare. Not on my body, but in my voice. I looked them all in the eye and said, yes, they did this. Yes, they thought they would own me forever. But here I stand, and I am not theirs anymore. Some were jailed. Some bought their freedom back with money and influence. My husband rotted in a cell until his sickness ate him alive. His brothers scattered like rats. Their mother died spitting curses at my name. And me, I walked away, broken, yes, burned, scarred, but breathing. And with each breath I learned something. Survival is not just living, it is choosing to rise, even when rising feels like dragging chains. Years later, when I look back, I don't see revenge as the victory. Revenge was only fire. Fire burns, fire destroys. But what stayed, what truly mattered, was this. I lived to tell it. I lived to look at you, at anyone who listens and say, they did not win. Child, if you remember anything from this story, remember this. Monsters can wear the faces of family, but monsters bleed. They fall, and when they do, it is the voice of the survivor that lasts, not their violence. So I sit here, old and weary, with hands that still tremble sometimes at night. But my voice is steady, and as long as I can speak, their darkness will never silence me again.